I'm Luke Russell from the discipline of philosophy at the University of Sydney. What counts as a life well lived? How should we treat each other? How should we respond when things go wrong? What goals should we pursue? What counts as human flourishing? For thousands of years, philosophers have been thinking and arguing about these issues. In this series of podcasts, The Philosophy of Living Well, I'll be interviewing some philosophers and asking them what philosophy has to teach us about how we ought to live. In this episode, I'm joined by Professor David Macarthur, who is my colleague here at the University of Sydney. And what we're going to discuss is whether life is worth living without art. And I'm going to begin with a quote from George Bernard Shaw, who says, "Without art, the crudeness of reality would make the world unbearable." So that's the thought that I want to explore in this episode. Is that right? And in this episode, I want to set aside the question of creating art or making art of your own and just focus on the appreciation of art. So, Dave, let's begin by clarifying some terms. When we talk about art, what is it that we're talking about?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Luke. To this first question, what I want to say is, just to back things up a little bit, thinking about art is it's a conceptual minefield. So when we say what is art, we don't really have bearings. We don't have a clear sense of what we're talking about. So I think the best we can do is reach for examples from our own experience. An art historian, Chris Steller, in the 1950s wrote a paper called The Modern System of the Arts. And in that he said, it's painting, sculpture, architecture and music and poetry that form a kind of important core of our idea of art. And of course, if you think about more modern forms like video games or film and television, photography has been a disputed category, then these could be considered art, but they're seen as more peripheral or outliers and to the core, because the core, those things we said before, like paintings or sculpture, go right back to the ancient Greeks. So Plato discusses those as well as music. And theatre in the ancient Greek time was poetic. So the dramatic theatre is another example, the thing that Aristotle talks about.
Great. So some people might think about art as especially good or valuable examples that fit into those categories that you mentioned. And they might say we shouldn't use the word art for trashy or poorly executed examples. So if someone makes a sculpture at home and it's an absolute train wreck, but they're very proud of it, and they tell everyone they're an artist and they've created this artwork, some people will say, no, that falls short of being art because it's no good. So how do philosophers think about this? Do we want to have some kind of evaluative criterion for whether something even counts as art? Or should we just say, look, if it's in those categories, if it's a piece of music or a sculpture or a painting or a theatrical work, then it is an artwork?
I think that the term art is already evaluative. So I don't think of it as just a descriptive or labeling term, just classifies some things in one way and not another. I think it already includes the notion of some positive value. So to say something's art is to say that it's good in some respect or other. I would say the following, that when you think about the examples, you think, well, what do we count as art? What do those things have in common? What features do they exemplify? So one of them is an artwork is something that grabs your attention and holds it. So it's got some sort of interest that doesn't wear out on one or two or three viewings. So art is something that grabs your attention and holds it for an indefinite amount of time. Philosophers and art historians have talked about the test of time for great works of art, and David Hume wrote about that in his writings. So great works have this indefinitely interesting feature. So we're still watching Shakespeare plays and talking about them. We're still listening to Mozart's operas. We're still reading George Eliot's novels centuries later. So these things hold our attention and interest, even across different languages, cultures, religions, and so forth. They have that remarkable feature. Another feature they have is they're emotionally powerful or gripping. So Plato noticed that great art, in his conception, those things were emotionally charged artifacts. And that's one of the reasons why he banishes poetry, indeed the arts in general from the just city of the Republic is because he's afraid of the power of the non-rational emotions to disturb people and upset the rational order that you're meant to be supposedly living by. So another feature that goes with that is the thought that art is something that's meaningful or that it's interpretable. We think of it as something that you can offer criticism of or readings of or interpretations of. I think people think better art is that which has more complex or good or interesting meanings associated with it.
Dave, you've said that in calling something an artwork, we're already evaluating it as having some kind of positive value. So this brings us to my next question. If we're thinking about the appreciation of art being an essential feature of a good life, what do we mean by that? Do we mean the correct appreciation of good and important artworks? Or is it something much thinner than that? Something that might amount to just go out there and watch some trashy movies and enjoy it?
Yep, this is a rich question, and indeed it breaks into a number of other questions. One of them is, do we think of an artwork as having a singular meaning which a correct interpretation recovers? So that's a kind of monism about interpretation, as it's called. Or are we pluralists? Do we think that a work of art has multiple readings or interpretations, each of which is equally good? Well, people disagree about this, and I'm on the pluralism side of this question. So I don't think it's right to say that there's a single right reading of a work of art. So one big issue that I guess I have to mention now is that I don't think of works of art as primarily just autonomous objects in a realm of these objects, which is, I think that's the dominant view. I think of it more as a relation between a person and this thing called the artwork, and art is really the experience that comes out of that relation. So the artwork, you could think of it as incomplete without the audience, and the audience brings something active, basically their imagination, to bear on the work, and out of that relationship of the artwork and the audience, you get this thing called artistic experience, or the experience you have of the work. And that's what's valuable. And I think to say, is there a correct way of experiencing a work of art? I've lost faith in that idea. I don't think that's right.
Okay, so the active appreciation of art is part of a good life. But what is it that the appreciation of art adds to a good life? Philosophers have got some different answers to this question. So one thing we might say is the good that you, the viewer or the appreciator, gets is a pretty basic good. It's just pleasure. Engaging with artworks is pleasurable, and that's what's good about it. There are other philosophers who want to go way beyond that. And some of them suggest what's good about appreciating art in your life is that art has a special power to heal the psychic injuries that we acquire as we go through life when things go wrong for us. So art might have some kind of therapeutic or healing value. Quite a different idea about the possible value of appreciating art is that we learn about the world through engaging with artworks. So is appreciating art good because it increases our knowledge? And then a fourth possibility is that appreciating art is good because that active process of appreciating a great artwork helps to shape your moral character, makes you into a more virtuous person. For example, perhaps a more compassionate person, a person who's better able to understand differences. So there's a range of quite different answers about good things that the appreciation of art might add to a good life. What are your thoughts about this?
I would say there's a bit of all of those answers is true, but it's just a grain of truth in all of them. So take pleasure. It is true that a lot of art leads to pleasure, but the greatest masterpieces of Western art, they can be, as Wittgenstein said, terrifying. And indeed, you might say, it's such a great work, I'm not sure I'm up to watching it now. Like, for instance, Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev, the film. is an amazing work, but it's a difficult work. It's a work that you wouldn't treat lightly. You wouldn't just say, "I'm just going out for an afternoon to have the pleasure of watching that film." King Lear is another example. There's lots of these examples. Kafka's novels or short stories, or think about the novels of Austen or George Eliot. There are pleasures along the way, but there's also a lot of tragedy. So I don't think it's just generally true that great works of art lead to pleasure. Let's go to some of the other things. So, morality. Does appreciating art make you a morally better person? No. Not if you mean by that the art expresses some moral theory or moral decision procedure or something like that. Definitely not. But I do think art is deeply involved with the moral.
So you've said that engaging with great artworks doesn't necessarily make you a morally better person. Might it sometimes make you a morally worse person?
Well, this is a great question. And I think yes, the answer to that has to be yes, because if art's about the effects on particular psyches, then it can certainly lead to bad consequences. And this can be by design. So Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will is a famous example of a Nazi propaganda film that you'd have to call a great movie in many ways. It's really well made. It involves lots of innovative shots that have emotional power that are interesting, but it's lauding the Führer. It's calling upon the audience to take a certain sort of pleasure in and to regard with great value Hitler and his control of the German people. There's something impressive and dangerous about it, I think. And so I think that sort of movie might lead you to not condemn Nazism as it should be condemned.
What do you think about the thought that engaging with great artworks is valuable because it teaches us about the world? So we ought to do it because of the independent value of the knowledge that engaging with art will give us.
So I want to divide what you said into two bits. So I don't think art is a source of knowledge. Some people think of our fundamental relation to art as rational. That's because there's this interpretive project of interpreting it and saying, what's better or worse interpretation. That seems like the interpretation of human action, which again is a rational process. You can deliberate about what someone meant to do in doing something. But with art, I think that's to forget that the fundamental relation art has to you is imaginative. And reason gets involved secondarily, I believe. So that what art does is it sets off your imagination, and in virtue of doing that, it sets off your emotions. And that's the primary thing it does, even though I do think it intimates things to you. So in that way, it can suggest truths to you, but I don't think the work actually preaches or asserts anything. So going back to the therapeutic and healing issue that you mentioned before, that was one of the options. Maybe the value of art lies in therapy and healing. I think that's probably closest to the truth of any of these options you've given me. And to explain that will take a little bit of doing, but let me try. Tolstoy says in his book, What is Art?, that people are fundamentally isolated. Like each person is a center of consciousness. They have a body. They have their own pains. The slings and arrows of outrageous fortune beat down upon them. And, they live life in their own consciousness. Yes, they interact with other people, but nonetheless, there's a sense in which each person lives their own life and no one else's. So he thinks, well, that leads to a sort of existential sense of isolation and loneliness. It can. And so he says, interestingly, that art is the source of overcoming that. Art is a source of intimacy because when you get a piece of art, when you respond to it, when you feel like it touches you, when you emote and feel engaged, it grabs your attention and it's holding your attention. And then you see that that's true of other people as well. You feel connected to them. And this is familiar. Like if you go into a bar and you meet someone who's a complete stranger and you share a love of Mozart's operas or you share a love of Cormac McCarthy's novels, you feel an instant rapport with that person. You feel an intimacy with them, which is quite surprising, given that you actually know nothing about them, but that they share a similar taste in an author or an artwork. So phenomenologically, I think Tolstoy is right that art is a source of intimacy.
So, Dave, you're saying that the appreciation of artwork and the shared appreciation of artwork is a way to create intimacy in otherwise isolated lives. How do you think appreciation of art does that job?
Well, I have a curious answer to this, and that is that art is a model of the self. Let me explain. So I feel like in modern philosophy, in post-Cartesian philosophy, a big issue is the mind-body problem or the mind-world problem. Like, how does the mind relate to the body? And it seems to me that that question has haunted modern thought. And I think in art is a playing out of a response to that question, because you also have art and art object distinction. So the term art there would capture the spirit of art, the sense that it's meaningful and valuable. And then there is this physical object, which is the artwork. And so that as you have the mind-body problem, you also have the artwork problem. And thinking about or responding to art is a way of responding to what, in our own experience, strikes us like another mind. So a curious thing, actually, about Descartes is that he considers the question of skepticism to be fundamentally one about how we know there's a world external to our mind. He doesn't ask the question that seems to be really close to that, and arguably more important from a moral point of view, which is, how does one mind know another mind? And this is the question you see Tolstoy, when he talks about intimacy, he's responding to this worry about how one mind knows another mind. And he's saying, through art, minds can connect. So what does art do that responds to this question? Well, I think it suggests that when you see a work of art, you take your experience seriously, and you don't take seriously the thought that all you're confronted with is a mere physical object. You're confronted with something that seems to express meaning and value. And to take that seriously is then to have a model for thinking about a person as this amalgam of mind and body, not two things that just happen to meet, but something that's an expressive center of meaning and value. So I think art provides a model for selves, and it plays out this Cartesian skeptical worry about how we respond to other people, whether other people are intelligible to us. So a famous thing in modernism is people are worried about the incomprehensibility of art. They go into a gallery and feel that, they don't get the work on the wall or on the floor. Well, that's playing out this worry that we don't understand other people. And when we do get art, we have this sense of, wow, a connection. And it's just like that connection we can have to another person. We feel a sense of relief almost when that happens. Tolstoy talks about the intimacy part, but I would also add that art plays out both sides of this. It plays out the incomprehensibility of some others and the comprehensibility, the skepticism and the overcoming of skepticism. It's not just one or the other, it's both.
Dave, you've made the case that appreciating art is a really important part of a good life. I want to ask you now, as an educator, if this is a fundamental good, do we need to teach people how to appreciate art? And if so, how should we go about doing that? Now, some modes of teaching about art might be very moralistic modes where different artworks, maybe famous artworks that form part of the canon, are presented as targets for moral criticism. But there is a different way of trying to teach appreciation of art, something that maybe is more similar to what you might find in a great books course or something like that, where the artworks are not treated as moral exemplars so much as important, valuable, fascinating objects. Do either of those models appeal to you, or do you think there's a different way we should teach appreciation of art?
I think both of those are valuable. Art can be a source of appalling characters like Iago in Shakespeare's Othello. And of course, you can, if you choose, teach morality through reading, say, the witty novels of Jane Austen, who pokes holes in social mores. But I do favour the great books idea. I think the way to teach art has to be by example, because I don't believe we have an essence of art. We don't have some clear sense of what it all boils down to. But I do have a rubric for what art is, and maybe I'll share it with you. So art seems to me to be something that feels like it makes more sense than you can put into words. So this is to say it stimulates your imagination. And then there's the question, can you put that imaginative material into language? And Kant talks about the sociability of art, the way art makes you want to express or articulate your experience of it with others. And this fits again with very well with Tolstoy, the idea of intimacy, that part of the joy of that connection is that you're able to express how that work has made you feel or think, and that the other person, for no clear causal or rational reason, unguaranteed, unpredictable, out of the blue, lines up with you. So you feel a like-minded soul, and it seems to be like an amazing gift that somebody else can align with you out of your sense that you're existentially lonely or isolated.
This suggests that there's a special kind of challenge for academics and others who are trying to write about art appreciation. If part of what it is to be a great artwork is to engage with an audience in a way that goes beyond their capacity to express, does that mean we are essentially falling short in the way that we write about art and art appreciation? It reminds me of the quote, writing about music is like dancing about architecture. You're never going to capture what really matters about music through writing about it.
I do and I don't agree. So I think because your relation to art is an ongoing experiential one, then there need be no final resting place. So the idea of an interpretation itself seems a bit confused to me. And it just seems to me to be a product of the fact that in schools and universities, art's often taught in terms of a set of questions you ask of the work, plot, structure, context, something like that. And you answer these questions, and there's your interpretation. But of course, as a good pragmatist, I'll say any inquiry is driven by questions, and you can ask as many questions as you like of the work. And also, you'll keep re engaging with the work. If it's a true work of art that grabs your attention, holds your attention, you'll keep re engaging with it. And every time you re-engage, you may see something different in it, and you may have new thoughts about it, new feelings about it. They won't stay stable.
Dave, I want to finish by asking you whether you think the appreciation of art is an essential good in life. And let me explain what I mean by an essential good. So there are some things like having friends, which seem to be so important to many of us, that we might think a life in which you have no friends is a life that's deficient. No matter what else you achieve, no matter what other good features are present in that life, there's something really important that's missing. Now, in contrast to having friends, there are lots of other things that we do which are valuable, often really fun, but don't seem to be at all essential to living a good life. So something like playing tennis, doing philosophy, gardening. So they're all fun things that we might do, and part of your flourishing activity in life might consist in playing tennis and doing philosophy and gardening. But it would be a much more controversial thought to say, look, if your life doesn't include any gardening, then it's fundamentally deficient. I think gardening's an optional good. You can have a great life even if you engage in no gardening. So where do you think appreciation of art fits in relation to those categories?
I would like to think it's essential. One thing that might point to that is the way in which, when you look at human history right throughout, there's always been artistic expressions, and they've always been at the heart of religious and practical, moral, and other rituals that we have. So if you think about religion, what would religion be without churches or places of worship, without religious icons or effigies, without stained glass, without Gothic cathedrals, without organ music? I mean, we are reflective creatures, and one thing we reflect on is our relation to other people, and art is fundamentally concerned with that. So if you think that reflecting on our relation to others is fundamental, then I think you're in the realm of art. I do think that puts you closer to it's non-optional, but I think that your sense of it being optional is right if you mean by art fine art. If you just mean a set of famous works in some famous gallery overseas, then yes, it's not clear that everyone has to care about the Mona Lisa or even Mozart's operas for that matter, or Shakespeare's plays or, you know, or Tolstoy's novels. It's not clear. But if you have a more liberal conception of art, where it does have this function of connecting you with others, either like-minded souls, then perhaps that is fundamental. So I think if you just don't get too fetishized about fine art, then it's more plausible that it does play this fundamental role in connecting you with others. And Plato saw that the fundamental thing art's about is love. Like, it inspires something like love in you. The idea that art's a model of the self gets played out in the kind of emotions that inspires in the people that love it. So you do love, people talk about loving art. That there's something right about that, in the sense that it's this ongoing attachment which is passionate and capable of moving you. Does it concern fundamental things in the human condition? If we had more time, we would talk about that, the way it engages with the questions of, as we just said now, love, but also death. It is interesting that when we commemorate the death of somebody, we do so in places where art is present. And you could argue that art is helping us move from being terribly grief-stricken and in a terrible state, a painful state, to something more reflective and melancholic, where we can sort of deal with the death through its relation to beauty.
Sometimes when we look back into human prehistory, people are looking for an achievement or a change which makes our distant ancestors suddenly feel like us. So some people might look at the first examples of human burial and say, look, they are like us now. Others might look to examples of humans in prehistory worshipping gods and say, this is a sign that those distant ancestors now are like us. What do you think about the idea that instead of those things, we should look to prehistoric cave paintings, the kind that we see in Australia, in the south of France, where we've got artworks that were created tens of thousands of years ago? Do you look at those and think, now these people are like us?
We're back to a difficult question, because if the concept of art is of relatively recent provenance, which it looks like it is. I mean, Christella said it was born in the 18th century. I think it goes back before that. Vasari wrote the lives of the artists in 1550. And the notion of artist as genius goes with the notion of an artwork as an autonomous thing, separate from other religion and science and so forth. But I do think, just as we can look at the Greeks and say, well, their notion of an emotionally charged artifact is pretty much our concept of art, or at least it could do the duty for that. And they could have had a term for it even if they didn't. And they seem to recognize it. So you could push this back in history, and I do think it gives a foothold for seeing ourselves in them, the fact that they do these things on the wall. No doubt they're doing them as part of rituals, but I see no problem with that. And I see no problem with thinking that maybe art isn't as autonomous as Kant thought it was. Kant says art is a work of disinterested contemplation, where it's sort of set in museums and behind ropes and on pedestals, and it's set away, in a sense, from the hurly-burly of everyday life. Maybe we don't need to think like that. Maybe we can think that art can be special without it having to be so disjoint from our everyday activities. But I think even if we think these works, these paintings on the walls did have some function in some ritual that we now has been lost, we don't know what it is, I think we can find our humanity through the connection, through the art.
I'm Luke Russell from Philosophy at the University of Sydney, and I've been talking in this episode of The Philosophy of Living Well with my colleague David Macarthur. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Luke.
This podcast series is presented by the discipline of philosophy in the School of Humanities at the University of Sydney.